Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Today I'm sharing my January wrap-up. January was such a good way to start off 2025 because I had a really good reading month. I read quite a few really good books and I really enjoyed participating in Epistolary January. While I read a few books that were real true epistolary novels, that all or the majority of the book were written in some kind of epistolary manner, that actually a lot of the books that I read for it only had parts of it that were, and some of them had less in them than I thought there would be. If they had one letter or one email in them, I'm still counting them because I went into it thinking they would be more than what they were. So I did DNF a couple of books in January, and I'm going to go with those first, and then I will get to what I read for Epistolary January. The book that I had intended to read for the contemporary epistolary book was a reread of Attachments by Rainbow Rowell. It's been quite a while since I read this. I remembered liking it, but I also was a little bit concerned about what some of the content might be that maybe I overlooked back then and I wouldn't now. And so I wanted to reread this for that prompt. But I was not very far into it before I DNF'd it and decided I would get rid of this. I found that I really wasn't being pulled in and I wasn't getting engaged in the characters or the storyline the way I thought I would from the way I remembered it. And I still pushed past that a little bit and decided I would keep giving it a chance. Maybe it would get better. And then I got to a point where there was excessive swearing. I realized this is going to have language I don't want to read, along with the fact that I'm not even enjoying the story or the characters. There is no reason to keep reading this. So DNF'd that. Then the other DNF is kind of a disappointment and one that I might actually like the book if I read the whole thing, but I just decided not to give it any more time. And that is The Lost Memoirs of Jane Austen by Siri James. I ordered this used, but I didn't expect it to be as used as it is. It is really bad condition. It's probably not showing up on camera as bad as it is, but it's falling apart, and then there's multiple pages have that kind of stain. It just feels really cheap and dirty when I'm touching it. And so I'm not sure exactly what this book has been through, but I didn't enjoy the copy I got. Now, that wouldn't necessarily mean I would DNF it. However, when I started to read the book, as many of you that have read it will know, it starts out with kind of a foreword to the book that makes it sound like these letters from Jane Austen were discovered and found in the wall of the house, and these are real letters that nobody knew about. I must not have been paying attention, but I thought these were real letters of Jane Austen. I did not know this was a fictional book. And so when I started reading that, I just assumed that was the truth. And I was surprised that I hadn't heard this whole story before. And I figured this must be a new thing because I went to Jane Austen's house in 2016 and didn't hear anything about this. So this must have happened since then. And so then as I'm reading, I stopped. I'm like, I just feel like this would have been something I would have heard about. I flipped to the back trying to see what the author's note was. And I saw the end, which also made it sound like these were real letters. And so then I did a little research and found out it was fiction. And I was very disappointed. I was sad that I didn't know that going in. And then since then, though, I have heard other people talking about it this month, and everybody's very clear on this being a fictional book. I know this was my mistake. It wasn't other people saying that it was real and me just, being fooled. It was that I didn't look into it enough before I bought it. I had so many other books that I wanted to read, and then having a copy that I didn't really want to pick up because it felt gross to read it. And I was just very disillusioned, I guess, by the fact that it wasn't real letters because I don't tend to like it when people make up stories about real people. If it's a fictionalized account of a real person, I want it to be as close as possible to the reality. And if I'm reading a book that is complete fiction, I tend to want it to be about somebody fictional and have the real person show up occasionally or something. I think I always put myself in the place of that person and wondering how they would feel to know that people are putting words in their mouth that they wouldn't have said. Hopefully that makes sense. So once I found out that it wasn't real letters and it was fake letters from Jane Austen, I just really didn't have any interest anymore. So it might be wonderful. I don't know, but that is why I DNF'd it. I posted the video of my Bible studies for 2025, and I have already finished The Faith Foundations, a study on the basics of Christianity. And this definitely was a very basic study. If you're looking for something that is extremely in depth, this is probably not the one I would choose. There wasn't a lot of new information for me either. However, I did get a lot out of it, and there were quite a few days when I took a lot of notes in my Bible. So it did lead me to things that took me a little bit further than even the text had. I love the way they give me the scriptures every day. For example, right now, I just flipped open to this one, What is Sin? Read Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, and James 1:14 through 15. And so I would get in my Bible and read those that day, and then read their spiel about it, then go through their questions. I didn't actually write my answers in the book because I thought I might want to use this again someday, or somebody else in my family might want to. So I would just think through the answers myself. So I did really enjoy this, and I am glad that I started the year with this one. So now on to the books I read for Epistolary January. The first book I read was Dracula by Dr. Stoker and J.D. Barker. This is the one I mentioned that is written as a prequel, kind of, to Dracula. But mainly what it is supposed to be showing Bram Stoker's life and how he came up with the story for Dracula. So it's kind of funny after just saying how I don't normally like books about real people, because that is what this is, and I loved it. However, this is written by a relative of his, and they say at the end that they basically took real facts from Bram Stoker's life, edited pages of Dracula, and notes from Bram Stoker, and then fictionalized all of it together. It was really funny how by the time this book was at the end, I was upset a little bit that it didn't end the way I wanted it to. And then I remembered, wait, if it ended the way I wanted it to, Dracula wouldn't happen. So I had to remind myself it was a prequel, not a retelling. I feel like it was more violent and a little bit bloodier maybe than Dracula. Not by a ton though, but it definitely made me feel that way. And it was, to me, scarier than Dracula, but it still wasn't too scary. And what I found really refreshing is the fact that this is a modern book. I thought that it would probably have a lot more language and different things in it that would make it feel very different than Dracula, but it didn't. It was still clean in language and content, and it really felt a lot like Dracula. I think they did such a good job with this. This book took me completely by surprise because I didn't even know it existed until a few months ago when Molly mentioned it. I was so interested that I got it for Christmas, and first, like I said, first read of the year, and it did not disappoint. I think that if you like Dracula and you're okay with it being a little bit scarier and a little bit more violent than Dracula, I think you would like it. I used this for the prompt package, a book that is longer than 400 pages. Then I read The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon, Volume 1 by Beth Brower. This is a book that I started to see in Barnes & Noble, I guess when they were first coming out. And since it was a modern book that's coming out that's popular enough to have a whole table at Barnes & Noble, I kind of assumed it would be something I didn't like. And I don't know why my brain goes there sometimes, but it does. I wanted to wait and see if anybody in the Christian BookTube community was talking about it as well. And so I've started to see it pop up here and there, and I decided I finally wanted to give at least the first one a chance, and Epistolary January would be the perfect time to do that. I read this for the Prompt Journal, a book containing journal entries. Obviously, since that is what it is, it's all journal entries of Emma M. Lyon. It says the year is 1883, and Emma M. Lyon has returned to her London neighborhood of St. Crispian's, but Emma's plan for a charmed and studious life are sabotaged by her eccentric cousin Archibald, her formidable Aunt Eugenia, and the slightly odd denizens of St. Crispian's. And so this tells a story of this young lady who has moved back to this neighborhood, to this home that she is supposed to be inheriting, and has to deal with different relatives. She describes the neighborhood a lot. I really wasn't sure what to expect from such a little book, and I found this to be so charming. It was so delightful. Those are the only words I can think of. It's only 106 pages, and I enjoyed every single one of them, and I can't wait to keep reading this series. I loved Emma. I felt like she was a great main character. She reminds me a lot of the heroines who we read about in Jane Austen and Anne of Green Gables. She just had some spunk and some innocence to her. I was really aggravated by some of the other characters in the book. I liked some of the other side characters. It was fast moving and interesting. One part that she wrote that I loved, rain, dismal enough to be cozy. And I loved that because when it is cloudy and rainy outside and it feels dismal, that is actually when I feel the most cozy and happy. I cannot wait to read the rest of the series. I'm going to have to go at it slow. Jen at Jen's Reading Life is doing a read along of the series this year. And so she is doing a volume every single month. And I thought that would actually be kind of fun. So unless I get antsy and decide to read them all at one time, I'm going to try to read them one a month, especially since I have to buy them all. So I will be reading volume 2 in February and so on. Next, I did a reread of The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaeffer and Annie Barrows. And as anyone who watches me knows, I have talked about this book a lot. I've talked about the movie adaptation a lot. It has been one of my favorite books and movies for a few years now. And so I was really excited to get back into this and reread it again. And I used it for the Love Letters prompt and epistolary romance. And what was so interesting about my reread of the book this time, reading it with new eyes like I do any book that I've probably read in the last 3 years, because during that time my life has changed a lot and so have my viewpoints on a lot of things. I found that while I still do love this book, and it still is almost a 5-star for me, I did find that there were some things that I remembered and some things that I didn't, that I would want to have as a content warning for people. There was more swearing than I remember there being in it. Still don't feel like it's excessive. There was one word that I had crossed off in my book. So I actually don't know what swear word it was I crossed off, but I had blacked it out. And so I must have done that the last time I read it. And so when I got to that part, I thought, okay, I don't know what is under here. I think it might be Jesus's name in vain. And so if it is, then that's something I know a lot of people don't want to read, but I'm not 100% sure that that was what was under there. I just think it was, because there were other instances of God's name that way. And that does bother me. And then Sydney's homosexuality was a little bit more talked about than I remembered it being. And I think it's just because I've watched the adaptation so many times now in between this time and last time that I read it. I talked about how good the adaptation is and how faithful it is to the book. But actually, as I was reading it this time, I realized how different it actually is. There are quite a few things that were changed for the adaptation. And one of them is that part of Sydney is less focused on in the movie than it is in the book. And then I felt like there was still a little bit of swearing in the movie, but it's minimal like the book. They've taken some characters and, mushed them together to make characters in the adaptation. What I found that surprised me is that I actually like the adaptation better than the book. And I did not see that coming, but I do. It wasn't the perfect read that I expected and thought it would be, but I still really do enjoy it. I still really love the story and the characters. And I did highlight a few of my favorite quotes in my journal. I can't think of anything lonelier than spending the rest of my life with someone I can't talk to, or worse, someone I can't be silent with. Perhaps there is some secret sort of homing instinct in books that brings them to their perfect readers. That's what I like about reading. One thing will interest you in a book, and then that thing will lead you onto another book, and another bit that will lead you onto a third book. And I've talked about that before, that one of the things that makes a really good book for me is when it leads me to go and find out other things. And then there was one quote that I thought was really funny, where she said, "How many men would admit they love ducks?" And I liked that because my husband loves ducks. So I thought that was really funny. The next book I read was The Fifth Avenue Story Society by Rachel Hauck. And I read this with my mom for our Inklings group. And I didn't think this would be epistolary in nature going into it, so that wasn't why I was reading it. But I did end up counting it for my free square because there were some text messages and things like that in it. So this is one of the ones I was talking about. It's not an epistolary novel like the last 3 were, but it does have some epistolary elements, so I just decided to count it. I really enjoyed her other books that I've read, and I expected this one to be a 5-star based on the storyline and what I've heard about it. This is a story of 5 people who get an invitation to come to this library to a story society. And when they get there, none of them know who has invited them, why they are there. And then the whole book is them getting to know each other and their troubles and opening up to each other. I enjoyed her writing in this, just like I did with her other books. I felt like it was an engaging story. I enjoyed the characters. And it did lead to a lot of really good discussion with my mom about the characters and the situations they were in. We had the same favorite characters, which was really nice. So that was fun to talk about. And that is, if you've read it, our favorite characters were Coral and then Jet. And we also had a lot of the same feelings about the book in general. And those feelings were that this book was good, the story was good, like I said, but that it moved really slowly to get to know the story, to get to know the characters. It felt like it was taking a long time to get to what would be the end of the book. And once you got to the end of the book, it was a few pages of everything wrapped up really nice and pretty, and it felt like it wrapped up too quickly and too perfectly. And it left us both wishing that we knew more and that there was more. This could have been a 5-star, but I felt like that the ending and then one other problem that I had with it took it down a little bit, and that was that something I did not expect from her other books is that there were quite a few sexual innuendos in this book. It wasn't like open door scenes necessarily, but there were mentions and there were things that the different characters thought. I wrote it down in my book and I was thinking about it, and then my mom said it, and so then we talked about it at the book club where we both felt that way. I marked in here where it says, Jet sat back against the wall and succumbed to the fatigue of the past 2 years. That sentence I felt really deep in my soul, because I feel that way about the last couple of years of my life. Like sometimes it just feels like so much has happened and so much has changed in the world and in our life that sometimes I almost just have to stop and just breathe and let it just sit for a minute in my mind of how different things are in my life. And so I felt that a lot. Again, I recommend it. I think it was really good, but there were just those couple of things that I wish would have been different. Then I did a reread of 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hamp. In this, Helene is writing letters to the workers in the bookshop in London and asking for books, specific books. They're sending them to her, and they start this correspondence that lasts over quite a long period of time. And this book is just very charming. My copy has the second book in it, The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street, I think is what it's called. And I did not reread that one because I did not like it the first time I read it. And I don't remember exactly why, but I just didn't feel like reading it again right now. Sometimes I just don't know how to describe books like this. They make you feel things for people that you've never known, that are real people. And that was what this book did for me. I wanted to know these people. I loved being able to get a look into their lives. I read that for the prompt, Lost Mel, a classic or a book by an author no longer with us. Then I read Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. I read this for free shipping, a book that was free because it was a gift from my aunt, not this Christmas, but the Christmas before that. And I'm really glad I finally got around to this book. It's about a woman who lives in London during World War II. And she wants to be a war correspondent, and she goes to answer an ad in the paper for the newspaper, thinking that that's what it will lead her to, and it ends up being an advice column. But I thought going into this that she was going to be the main person that people were writing to for advice, but she is actually an assistant who is going through the letters and weeding out what the main advice writer deems inappropriate. And that was really frustrating. That woman drove me nuts. And I found that her answer to that, like sometimes it was okay, sometimes it wasn't. It was a little bit stressful. And I felt like the story could have been a lot stronger. I felt like that she could have taken that idea and really run with it instead of having it be something that she was kind of doing on the side secretly. I guess I just felt like the story, if you've read it, maybe you'll understand. I felt like it would go further than it did. I expected this to be more epistolary than it was. It actually was mostly just written in a regular style with letters occasionally sprinkled in. It also ended a little bit abruptly because I think it's a series. There was one character in the book that also used God and Jesus in swearing. So that also bothered me. So I did enjoy this a lot, but it definitely could have been better. And there were a few things that kept it from being my favorite of the month. The next book I read was The House of My Mother by Sherry Frankie. This is a memoir of Sherry Frankie. She's telling her side of the story. If you know who the Frankies are, they were family vloggers, and her mother is now in prison for abuse of the 2 youngest children. However, in this book, Sherry is showing us how her mother really didn't start being abusive at the very end. She's really been that way the whole time. It's just in a different extent. I did a whole deep dive video on this book, so if you want to know more and spoilery things about it, and deep discussions about a lot of the things that were in it. I found that when I was reading it, I was just going to review it like this in this video, but I found that I had a notebook next to me and I was taking notes and annotating in the book things that it was making me think about and things that I thought that the average reader might not know in connection to some of the things she was talking about. And so I really wanted to make a deep dive and talk about the things, the rabbit holes it sent me on, and the things that I felt deserved a little bit more attention, or the things that I wanted to talk about with somebody while I was reading it. That was what the deep dive video was about. So you can go and see that. This wouldn't have been for Epistolary January. In fact, I didn't know that it was coming out until January had already started. But because this did have emails and text messages in it, and I had DNF'd the attachments book, I decided that I would count this for the contemporary epistolary featuring text and or email because it had both. Then I did my reread of Anne of Green Gables. Like I said in my video leading up to this year, I was planning on rereading Anne of Green Gables this year, the whole series. And so when Chantel announced the read-along of different Lucy Maud Montgomery books, I was so excited because it went along with what I wanted to do. And so Anne of Green Gables was the book for January. And I did do a live show with Tiffany and Chantel the other night. That was so much fun, just being able to talk about the book. So you should go watch that for our discussion on the book. It was so lovely to reread this. It's so much fun to get back into this world with characters. And I mean, Avonlea feels like a character. Prince Edward Island feels like a character. It's just a place that I love and people that I love. I've thought about doing more in-depth videos of all of Lucy Maud Montgomery's books as we read them this year, but I actually think what I will do is possibly do just one video at the end when I've read the whole series again. If you want me to do one about each different book, let me know. If I don't get enough people that want that, then I will probably just wait and do one at the end for the whole series. This was another one that would not have been for Epistolary January. I didn't expect it to count, even though I've read it before and I know there's letters in it. But then, because I DNF'd the Austen memoir that I was going to be using for Set in a Foreign Country, I decided to count this. Since some of the other books that I'm counting really did end up just being normal books with a few epistolary elements in it, this is too. So this has a few letters in it from when Anne goes away. So I decided to use this for airmail set in a foreign country. It is still my favorite book. It is still 5-star. I love everything about Anne of Green Gables. Then I read The Berlin Letters by Catherine Ray. And this tells the story of a girl who works for the CIA. She is in code breaking. And it's telling the story going back and forth between her perspective and her father's perspective. So you see what is happening leading up to the Berlin Wall being put up. And then her perspective of finding these letters and finding out information about her past that she doesn't know. And then this isn't a spoiler because it says right on the back, she journeys to Berlin to risk everything to free her father and get him out of East Berlin alive. It's all kind of leading up to that. The first part of the book is mostly her finding out information and trying to piece things together. And then the second half of the book is going to Berlin. Since you're getting her dad's perspective as well, there is a lot more of Berlin in it than just the end. I thought I would like it because I've liked the books by Catherine Ray that I've read. But this is the first one I've read by her that is this type of novel. I used it for correspondence, any book containing letters between people, fictional or not. The only thing that took me out of the story occasionally was the present tense writing. I feel like I'm reading so many more books lately that are written with present tense, at least in part of the book. And I don't like present tense. And so it takes me out of the story a lot because for some reason to me, when somebody is writing in present tense style, it feels less natural. I'm not sure why that is. And this book did that sometimes. And so every once in a while I would get used to it and then I would be reading a part and it would do it and it was jarring to me. I'm not sure. It's another one of those maybe unpopular opinions. Maybe it's a popular opinion. I don't know. But I don't like present tense. So that took me out of the story a little bit. But I found that it was really good. It was really interesting. I haven't ever read a Berlin Wall or Cold War type book that was exactly like this one. I've read a few more. Anne said on her channel the other day that she was seeing more Cold War and Berlin Wall type books, and I've been noticing that as well. I have one more book on my TBR shelf that is about this time period as well that I haven't got to yet. And so I do think it's maybe going to be something that we start seeing more of, which I am all for. I really enjoy learning more about it. I was talking to my husband about it afterwards, saying it's so weird to me that so much of what was happening in this book was during my childhood. And I talked about how at one part I'm like, here she is doing this thing and these people are going through what people were going through. And here I was watching Full House and dancing to New Kids on the Block. So carefree. It's just interesting to read that perspective. I'm really looking forward to reading more books set in this time period and learning more about this history. I loved how in the book it talks about someone watching The Bishop's Wife with Cary Grant and Loretta Young 3 times before having to return it to Blockbuster, because that is my favorite Christmas movie. I don't often hear people talk about it, and so I loved seeing that. I would definitely recommend this book. Between all of those, I marked off all the prompts in Epistolary January. Like I said, they weren't all complete 100% epistolary novels, but I loved focusing on epistolary books and having a few that were, and then having some that had those elements. I felt like this was such a good reading month where I loved, with the exception of the couple of books I DNF'd, I loved every other book. This was such a fun readathon, and I'm so glad that Anne decided to do this readathon and that I was able to be one of the co-hosts. The one last book that I read this month was Different by Sally and Nathan Clarkson. This was my nonfiction of the month that I was reading in the morning after my scripture study. This tells the story of, she says, the outside the box kid and the mom who loved him. Nathan has OCD and ADHD, and he tells his perspective on something in his life, and then Sally comes in and tells her perspective of the same thing as a mom. They give such good advice in here. It was such a encouraging and interesting book. I was so surprised that I hadn't read this book before, because I love Sally Clarkson. I look at her as kind of a homeschool mentor. I've read so many of her books. I love listening to her and learning from her, because she is someone who has gone before me, who has children older than mine. They've all gone through homeschool, because sometimes it's hard to be a homeschool mom that has older children, and most of the people I'm watching have younger children, so I can learn from them, but I can't necessarily get the same wisdom I would get from somebody who has already gone through what I'm going through, and, see where their children end up and how they're doing and all of that kind of encouragement that I think we need from someone who has already done it. But sometimes it feels like when I'm reading her stuff that she has this ideal life where, something that I want to aspire to, but probably can't quite measure up to. And this book laid it all out there that isn't true, that she had the same struggles we all have, and they went through hard things, and they had days when their morning time or their read alouds were interrupted. And it was so encouraging to see this person who I look up to and whose children have turned out great, that they had the same struggles all of us homeschooling and parents, and families in general have. And so I am so glad that I finally read this book by her and by Nathan. As far as my yearly challenges for January, I didn't read any Agatha Christie books, obviously. The Year of Maud, I checked off January. The Reading the Classics, January was a book from your physical TBR. And originally I wanted to pick a book that was on my unread shelf, but I decided that I was going to just choose Anne for that because it was on my TBR for January. And then for the scavenger hunt, I was able to mark off book, male protagonist, and winter all in Anne of Green Gables. I did keep from buying books in January with the exception of the one with credit. And then for the Princess Bride-a-thon, since Katie didn't match up anything with a month, I just put in a few of the books I read this month, and if they counted. So I used 84 Charing Cross Road for the Princess Buttercup Red on the cover. I used The House of My Mother for The Fire Swamp, a hot new release. I used the Fifth Avenue Story Society for MLT, Meeting Love Twice, for a second chance romance. So that was fun to be able to mark off some of those. And then for Read Your Bookshelf Challenge for January's Word of Beauty, I chose to use Emma M. Lyon for that because I felt like the book looked beautiful and it was beautiful in content as well. And then I was able to mark off quite a few of the books on the 52 Book Club Challenge with books that I read this year. So that shows kind of how I'm using their bingo board as I go along. So every time I finish reading a book, I skimmed through their prompts to see if it would mark off one of those. And then a few of them on the Family Challenge as well. And then for Jane Reed's Christian Fiction Challenge, I used Anne of Green Gables for January Start a Series. I was also able to mark off a few of the centuries and decades on Alma's. As I said, I'm not doing it the way she has designed it. I'm just marking off whenever I read a book from one of those places. But I'm only counting the book for one side, not for both sides. And then I didn't read anything in my American literature course yet. So those are going to be in February. I'm going to hopefully get to the first 1 or 2 books in that course and my first Agatha Christie book, and then a few other books that I really need to get to. I am not participating in any readathons in February. There are so many really fun ones. There's a bunch of other books that I've really been wanting to get to the last couple of months. I'm going to take February to mood read and read the books that I want to get to for my challenges, just see where that goes, because I know that I'm going to be doing middle grade March in March. And so I didn't do a TBR video for February this time because I just don't know for sure everything I'm going to be trying to read. I'll just be doing a wrap up to share what I do end up reading in February. My favorite books of January were, of course, my reread of Anne of Green Gables and Emma M. Lyon. Those were the two winners of the month. I would love to hear what your favorite book in January was. If you took part in Epistolary January, was your favorite book of the month one of the epistolary novels? And let me know if you've read any of these books and if you have any thoughts on them.